One of the figureheads of the Japanese war effort was Hideki Tojo. He was the Prime Minister of Japan for most of World War II, and he also had a number of other positions within the hierarchy of the Japanese government. After the Second World War, he was sentenced to death for being complicit in a number of Japanese atrocities. Tojo was an advocate for a preemptive strike on the United States of America, and deemed the attack on Pearl Harbor to have been a necessary one. He's seen today as a man who was linked to the horrific Japanese war crimes, such as the Baatan Death March and the slaughter of millions. Following the end of the war, the Tokyo War Crimes trials found Tojo guilty of a number of charges, and he was sentenced to death. Join us today as we look at the vengeful execution of Hideki Tojo, Japan's World War II Prime Minister, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Hideki Tojo was born in the Kojimachi district of Tokyo, Japan, on December 30th, 1884. His father was a Japanese Army Lieutenant General, and he followed in his father's footsteps in the military. He had a typical Japanese education, and at the time this was to train the boys to be soldiers as adults, and it was relentlessly driven into Japanese children that war was a beautiful thing. It was also taught that the greatest honour for a Japanese man was to die for his country and for the emperor, and Tojo was known for being an opinionated but serious student who lacked a sense of humour. He attended Army Cadet School in 1899, then went on to the Japanese Military Academy at the age of 20. A year later he had completed courses there and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. In 1909 he married, and over the years the couple had 3 sons and 4 daughters. 3 years later he entered the Army Staff College and rose to the rank of captain, and he eventually became the commanding officer for the 3rd Imperial Guards. He must have been a skilled and valued member of the Japanese military, as he then went to Germany to serve as part of a Japanese military attaché. Promotions continued for Tojo, and after he became a colonel, he began to become more involved in militaristic politics as he became more outspoken. In 1934, he became a Major General and then served inside of the Army Ministry. He was appointed the commander of the Japanese Army's 124th Infantry Brigade and was known for his quick decision-making and for being sharp. For this he was assigned to the Kwantung Army as its head of the military police, and during the February 26th incident he stood against the rebels and emerged as the army's leading political figure. He then became the Chief of Staff for the Kwantung Army and later deployed his troops to the Hubei province after the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The army played a key role in using the resources of Manchuria to utilise in Japanese industry. When he returned to Japan, he became the Vice-War Minister and the Chief of Army Aviation under the War Minister Saishiro Itagaki. As he was the most senior figure in the Army's aviation ministry, he began to order aggressive preemptive airstrikes against China and Russia, but in July 1940 he became the War Minister. In this role he went on the front foot in the Second Sino-Japanese War and was a key player in forming the Axis alliance between Nazi Germany, Japan and Italy. Japan at the time sought to expand its empire, and Tojo was at the forefront of these militaristic policies, and he was seen as an aggressor at the time. Eventually these policies led to the Japanese being sanctioned economically by the US and by Britain. On October 16th, 1941, the former Prime Minister resigned, and Tojo was then appointed to the post. He said, "I thought I was being summoned because the Emperor was angry at my opinions." However, 2 days later he was named the 40th Prime Minister of Japan. His first job was to work out whether war was avoidable, but it was reported weeks later that there was no way of reaching a peaceful solution with the Western powers, and following this the Emperor gave his consent to all-out war. On the 8th of December 1941, Tojo went on the radio and informed the Japanese people that they were now at war with America, Britain and the Netherlands. At the start he had the support of the Japanese people, as they made big advancements and victories initially. As the Prime Minister he was also in charge of the war effort, and it was under his control that many of the war atrocities conducted by the Japanese soldiers occurred. For example, during the Doolittle raid, where the Americans bombed Tokyo, a number of Allied airmen were captured and executed in barbaric fashion. But following the Battle of Midway, the tide of the war was turning against Tojo, and he began to encounter some opposition. He managed to establish, in a sense, some dictatorial powers, based on the support he had from the Emperor, and together in September 1943, both of them agreed that Japan would pull back to a defensive line in the Southwest Pacific to try and slow down the American advances. Tojo even tried to attempt to broker peace with China, but this did not work, as it's considered that during the negotiations he even planned offensives against the Chinese. The Americans continued to go on the offensive and made advancements against key Japanese areas and infrastructure, and more criticism came Tojo's way. Tojo then took personal control of the army in February 1944, and he had the support yet again of the Emperor. He planned to win the war, but under his command he launched a number of huge offensives. He ordered the failed invasion of India, which resulted in 72,000 Japanese soldiers being killed, in battle with around the same being killed from disease and starvation. More death came during the Battle of Saipan, with 70,000 Japanese members of the military killed, and the Americans had established bases in the Marianas, meaning they could inflict further misery on the Japanese through disastrous bombing campaigns. Following this battle, it was clear to many that the war was lost and that peace needed to be made, and following the fall of Saipan, Tojo was forced to resign on the 18th of July 1944. As the Japanese surrendered in 1945, the Americans began to search for 40 individuals who were suspected of committing war crimes and were responsible for the Second World War and atrocities conducted by the Japanese army. Tojo was sought for arrest, and he was seen by the Americans as the main aggressor on the Japanese side. His location was found, and 5 American soldiers were sent to go and arrest Hideki Tojo, but as his house was surrounded on the 11th of September 1945, Tojo took aim with his pistol and shot himself in the chest, knowing he was going to be taken prisoner. He saw it as more noble to take his own life than to go through war crimes proceedings. When he fired his pistol, he shot himself in the chest but missed his heart, and at the time the Americans were able to save his life. As he bled heavily, Tojo began to speak, and he said, "I am very sorry it is taking me so long to die. The Greater East Asia War was justified and righteous. I am very sorry for the nation, and for all races of the greater Asiatic powers. I wait for righteous judgment of history. I wish to commit suicide, but sometimes that fails." After he recovered, he was moved to Sugamo prison. Allegedly, he was even given a set of dentures here, and an American dentist inscribed them in Morse code, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Tojo was placed on trial at the Tokyo War Crimes Trials and was found guilty of waging wars of aggression, waging war in violation of international law, unprovoked or aggressive war against various nations, and ordering inhumane treatment of prisoners of war. It was estimated that the number of deaths due to crimes committed by the Japanese army under his control ranges from 3 to 14 million. This was through massacre, starvation, forced labour, human experimentation, and horrific conditions. Tojo in his trial took full responsibility, and he said, "It is natural that I should bear entire responsibility for the war in general, and needless to say, I am prepared to do so. Consequently, now that the war has been lost, it is presumably necessary that I be judged so that the circumstances of the time can be clarified and future peace of the world would be assured. Therefore, with respect to my trial, it is my intention to speak frankly, according to my recollection, even though when the vanquished stands before the victor, who has over him the power of life and death, he may be apt and flatter. I mean to pay considerable attention to this in my actions, and say to the end that what is true, and what is false. To shade one's words in flattery to the point of untruthfulness would falsify the trial, and do incalculable harm to the nation, and great care must be taken to avoid this." On the 12th of November 1948, he was sentenced to death, and was to be executed by hanging. He was to be executed alongside a number of other men sentenced to death at the Tokyo trials on the 12th of December 1948. Tojo was executed a week before his 64th birthday, and his execution took place at his site of incarceration, Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. The men who were condemned were held inside here to wait their execution, and the men were guarded by members of the US military. Hideki Tojo gave his military ribbons to one of his guards during his incarceration. At the time, President Truman wanted photographs and videos of the executions of the Japanese men, including Tojo's. But General MacArthur defied this order, as he was worried about rebellion in the Japanese population, caused by the outrage if these images got out. 4 members of the Allied Council were brought in to watch the executions. Tojo, during his execution, begged the Americans who were the ones carrying out the sentence to be compassionate and kind to the Japanese people after his death. He also apologised for the atrocities committed by the Japanese under his command. Each of the men were executed in a similar way. They were brought from their cells to the gallows inside of the courtyard of the prison. These gallows were very busy inside of Sagamo prison following the war, as hundreds were executed for war crimes. Tojo had his identity confirmed, whilst there were only very few witnesses to watch the proceedings. After this, he was led up the stairs of the gallows before being handed over to the executioner. A black hood was placed over his head, and checks were made to ensure that his legs and arms were secured. Following this, a noose was then placed around his neck, and a priest accompanied him during his final moments. Following the final checks, the hangman then pulled the lever, which released a trapdoor, and Tojo plunged to his death. The execution was done in rather secret conditions to ensure that very little backlash emerged. General MacArthur's biggest worry was that the Japanese population would rise up in the wake of the executions and cause chaos for the occupying forces. A short confirmation statement of the execution of Hideki Tojo was released once all of the 7 men had been killed. After his execution, Hideki Tojo was cremated and his ashes were scattered around 30 miles east of Yokohama from a US Army aircraft on the day of his execution. The proceedings were carried out very quickly. Hideki Tojo was seen as one of the key figures behind the Japanese war effort, and after the Second World War, he was executed as a symbol of war crimes committed by the Japanese. There were many more executions carried out of Japanese war criminals, but in his final moments, Tojo wished for the Americans to show compassion towards his people. He is considered still today a rather controversial figure in Japan. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.